Have you ever tried to, say, run down the stairs while holding a full cup of hot coffee?
Oh, that's a great image.
Right. The effort there isn't about brute force. It's all about these tiny rapid fire adjustments, stabilization, absorbing shock, delicate balance.
And then you contrast that with something like the sheer explosive power you need just to stand up from a deep, heavy squat.
Exactly. And the body manages these wildly different jobs with just one system, the appendicular musculature.
It really is the system that defines human movement. And our mission in this deep dive is to map that whole system out, from the little stabilizers in the shoulder all the way down to the powerhouses in the legs.
We're going to distill the structure, the function, and hopefully give you some predictive principles so you're not just memorizing names.
And that word prediction is so key here, because we have to start with this fundamental difference between the upper limb and the lower limb. It governs everything else.
It's a trade-off, isn't it?
It's a classic structure-function trade-off. The upper limb, so the pectoral girdle, it's built for maximum mobility, for shock absorption.
Which is only possible because it's not really locked into the rest of the skeleton.
Precisely. The shoulder is mostly stabilized by muscles, and that gives you this incredible freedom to move your arm, in 3 dimensions, while also doing delicate work with your hands.
Okay, so that's mobility. But the pelvic girdle and the lower limb, totally different story.
That entire system evolved for stability, for weight transfer, and for just raw power generation. The pelvic girdle is bound so tightly to the axial skeleton.
So that strong connection, it limits the range of motion.
It has to. It trades that speed and versatility for pure, unadulterated strength.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the rules of muscle mechanics that apply to every single limb we're going to talk about.
This is the foundation.
If we know just 2 things, the origin and the insertion, we can basically predict the movement. And it's all defined by what's called the action line.
Right. So when a muscle contracts, it shortens. It pulls the insertion site toward the origin, the direction of that force, that pull. That's the action line.
And the movement you get just depends on how that line crosses the joint's axis of motion.
Entirely. That's the whole game.
And this principle, it immediately shows us something really clever about muscle design. It leads us right to spurt versus shunt muscles.
Yes. This is such a wonderful example of leverage in the body. I mean, think about the brachioradialis. It's a big muscle in your forearm.
Okay.
Its insertion is pretty far from the elbow joint. So because of that distance, when it contracts, most of its force is directed along the bone.
So it's pulling the joint surfaces together.
Exactly. It's stabilizing. This is a shunt muscle. Its main role is powerful joint stabilization, acting as a synergist in addition to producing some movement.
So then the opposite must be true. If the insertion is closer to the joint, like with the biceps or the triceps,
Then that force vector is more perpendicular to the bone.
which gives it maximum leverage for rotation.
Maximum torque. That's a spurt muscle. Its goal is pure movement. It's a prime mover. So just knowing where a muscle attaches tells you if its priority is moving the limb or holding the joint steady.
And we can apply these same rules to really complex joints like the shoulder or the hip, right? We don't have to memorize a list of 20 muscles.
Not at all. If you just learn 4 general rules about that action line, the position tells the whole story.
So rule 1, if a muscle's action line crosses the anterior aspect of the joint,
Meaning it sits in front of the axis.
when it shortens, it pulls that bone forward. So it has to be a flexor.
It's generally a flexor and quite often a medial rotator as well.
And the opposite, if it crosses the posterior aspect of the joint.
Then it has to be an extensor and usually a lateral rotator.
Simple enough. What about up and down?
The same logic applies. If the muscle's action line is acting inferior to the joint axis, it's going to pull the limb away from the midline. That's abduction.
And if it crosses superiorly, it's adduction, pulling it in.
The deltoid is the textbook example here. The muscle as a whole crosses lateral to the joint axis, so its overall primary action is pure abduction.
With those rules in mind, let's travel north. Let's look at the pectoral girdle and the upper limb, starting with the muscles that just position the scapula.
Okay, so if you look at the back, the first thing you see is that massive diamond-shaped trapezius muscle.
It's huge.
It is. And because it's so big, different parts of it can contract on their own. The upper fibers elevate, the middle ones retract, the lower ones depress.
But they also work together.
Yes. The upper and lower fibers team up to produce upward rotation of the scapula, which is what allows you to lift your arm all the way over your head.
Okay, so if we peel that trapezius back, we find deeper muscles that do the opposite things.
You do. You find the rhomboids, major and minor, and they pull the scapula toward the spine. That's adduction, and that cause downward rotation.
And the levator scapulae, the name kind of gives it away.
It sure does. It just elevates the scapula. That's your classic shrugging motion.
Now, on the chest side, you've got this powerful fan-shaped muscle, the serratus anterior.
Right. It attaches to the ribs and then wraps around to the scapula. This muscle is the primary protractor or abductor of the scapula. It pulls it around the chest wall.
So, like when you throw a punch.
Exactly. The punching muscle, if that muscle is paralyzed, the scapula wings out, it just peels off the back.
Okay, moving to group 2. The muscles that actually move the arm at the shoulder joint. The deltoid is the big one, the major abductor.
It is. But for those first few degrees of movement, there's a tiny little muscle called the supraspinatus that helps get the process started.
And that little assist is actually part of a much bigger, much more important story.
The rotator cuff, yes.
Yeah.
This group of 4 muscles is just absolutely critical.
Why?
Because they stabilize that inherently weak, very mobile shoulder joint. You need them to constantly compress and center the head of the humerus in that shallow socket throughout its huge range of motion.
So these are the 4 everyone's heard of. The supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis, and teres minor.
The sits muscles.
Sits. And clinically, this is a major point of failure, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Because the shoulder is built for mobility, it's always dealing with high-speed forces. Rotator cuff injuries, especially to that supraspinatus tendon, often come from repetitive, high-velocity movements.
Like throwing a baseball.
Throwing a baseball, swinging a tennis racket. It's an overuse injury from the constant demand for stabilization.
So for the big, powerful movements of the arm, we have 2 giants. On the front, the large pectoralis major.
Which flexes, adducts, and medially rotates the humerus, basically clamping the arm across the chest.
And its huge antagonist on the back.
The latissimus dorsi. It's specialized for the opposite. Extension, adduction, and medial rotation. That's your chin-up muscle.
Okay, moving down the arm, muscles that move the forearm and hand. The triceps brachii is the pure elbow extensor.
It is, and it's important to remember its long head actually originates up on the scapula, so it can influence the shoulder joint too.
And then there's the biceps brachii, primary elbow flexor, but it has a crucial secondary job.
Supination of the forearm. And the reason this matters is all about biomechanics. You see, the biceps tendon inserts on the radius. When your forearm is supinated, palm up,
Right.
the tendon wraps around the radius in a way that just maximizes its line of pull for flexion.
That's why you can lift heavier weights with your palm up than with your palm down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You also have other key flexors like the deep brachialis in our shunt muscle example, the stabilizing brachioradialis.
And that whole pronation supination thing is a constant balancing act.
It is. Pronation, turning your palm down, is handled by the pronator teres and pronator quadratus.
And supination, palm up, is done by the supinator muscle and, again, the biceps brachii. It's just incredible dexterity.
It is. Then at the wrist, we're really talking about tendons. The main wrist movers, the flexors and extensors, they also perform adduction or abduction at the same time.
So, for example, the flexor carpi ulnaris.
Flexes and adducts the wrist. It pulls it inward. While the flexor carpi radialis flexes and abducts it, pulls it outward. Same principle on the extensor side.
Okay, but now we have a huge number of tendons all crossing this one small joint. They need some kind of mechanical scaffolding.
They absolutely do. And that's provided by these thickened sheets of deep fascia called the retinacula.
The straps.
They're like heavy-duty straps. You have the extensor retinaculum on the back of the wrist and the flexor retinaculum on the palm side. They hold the tendons down and stop them from bowing out when the muscles contract.
So they keep everything running smoothly.
Exactly. And the tendons are also housed in these little protective slippery tubes called synovial tendon sheaths.
Which brings us to a major clinical problem, carpal tunnel syndrome.
Yes.
Yeah.
When repetitive stress causes inflammation and fluid to build up in those flexor tendon sheaths, the swelling has nowhere to go. It's all trapped beneath that rigid flexor retinaculum.
So the pressure starts to build.
The pressure rises, and it compresses the very sensitive median nerve, which also runs through that tunnel.
And that's what causes the classic symptoms.
The pain, the tingling, the numbness, and often that profound weakness you feel in the thumb, index, and middle fingers. It's a direct result of anatomy.
Okay, so finally we get to the hand itself. We have 2 groups of muscles here.
We do. The ones that originate up in the forearm and run these long tendons down to the fingers are the extrinsic muscles. They provide the powerful, crude grip strength.
But the fine motor control comes from somewhere else.
That comes from the intrinsic muscles. These originate right there on the carpal and metacarpal bones in the hand.
And they're responsible for that one uniquely human movement.
Opposition. The opponent's pollicis muscle lets the thumb cross the palm to touch any other finger. It's what gives us the ability to grasp tools and manipulate tiny objects.
Before we pivot, let's quickly touch on the idea of compartments in the upper limb.
Right, so deep fascia separates the arm and forearm into these functional groups. Each one has its own specific nerve and blood supply. In the arm, you have an anterior flexor compartment and a posterior extensor compartment.
And in the forearm, it's a bit more complex.
It's broken down into anterior for the flexors, lateral for the radial group, and posterior for the extensors. It's logical, but the clinical side of these rigid compartments is even more serious when we get to the lower limb.
Which is our perfect transition. Let's pivot hard to the lower half. We're switching from mobility to, well, just sheer power and stability.
And it all starts with that pelvic girdle being locked into the axial skeleton.
So let's start with the powerhouses that move the thigh at the hip. The most powerful hip flexor is what?
That would be the iliopsoas group. It's a merger of two muscles, the psoas major and the iliacus, deep inside the pelvis. It's what you use to lift your entire leg up.
And on the backside, dominating everything, are the gluteals.
The huge gluteus maximus drives hip extension and lateral rotation. It's essential for standing up, climbing stairs, running.
But deep to that, there are two others that are just as important for stability.
The gluteus medius and minimus. They are vital. They handle abduction and medial rotation. When you walk, they stop your pelvis from dropping on the side where your leg is lifted off the ground.
And then you have the tensor fasciae latae, which pulls on that enormous lateral band.
The iliotibial tract.
Yeah.
That tract provides this crucial lateral bracing for your knee when you're balancing all of your weight on just one leg.
Okay. And medially, on the inside of the thigh, we have the adductor group.
Right. There are 5 of them, but their collective job is simple. Adduction, pulling the leg back toward the midline. If you strain one of these, that's the common pulled groin.
What's fascinating, though, is that one of them, the adductor magnus, is so big it almost has a second job.
It does. Its posterior fibers actually act like a hamstring muscle, helping out with extension at the hip. It's a great example of functional overlap.
Okay, so that brings us down to the knee. And this is where we hit that anatomical role reversal that can be a bit confusing.
It can be. Because of how the lower limb rotates embryologically,
Mm-hmm.
in the womb, the whole thing twists.
So what was on the front ends up on the back and vice versa.
In a way, yes. It means the muscle groups that end up anterior to the knee joint are specialized for extension, and the muscles that end up posterior are specialized for flexion. It's the opposite of the elbow.
So on the front of the thigh, we have the powerful knee extensors, the quadriceps femoris.
The quads, 4 muscles. The 3 vastus muscles, lateralis, medialis, and intermedius, are pure knee extensors. That's their only job.
But the fourth one, the rectus femoris, is special.
It's the overachiever because it originates up on the pelvis, on the ilium, not on the femur.
So it crosses 2 joints.
Crosses the hip and the knee, which means it's the only quad muscle that can also help with hip flexion, in addition to its main job of extending the knee.
And they all merge into that single quadriceps tendon.
Yes, which encloses the patella, the kneecap, and then terminates as the patellar ligament.
Okay, so posteriorly, we have the antagonists, the hamstrings.
Biceps femoris, semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. They are the knee flexors.
But like the rectus femoris, they also cross the hip joint.
They do. Because they originate on the pelvis, on the ischial tuberosity, they also serve as powerful extensors of the hip. They are crucial for accelerating your body forward when you run.
And clinically, that dual function leads to a very notorious problem.
Hamstring strains. They're incredibly common because the hamstrings function as violent antagonists. When you sprint, your quads fire explosively to swing your leg forward.
And the hamstrings have to immediately and forcefully contract to slow it down.
Right, and that puts an incredible amount of tension on their attachment points. It's a recipe for injury.
And we can't forget the little muscle that unlocks the knee.
The popliteus, a small, deep muscle. When your knee is fully long in extension, the poplite has to contract first. It causes a slight medial rotation of the tibia, and that's what unlocks the joint so the hamstrings can take over.
Okay, down to the foot. The extrinsic muscles, the calf muscles, are the primary movers here.
Yes. The big, visible gastrocnemius is great for fast, powerful plantar flexion, like when you're jumping.
But deep to it is the real workhorse.
The soleus. It's full of slow-twitch postural fibers. It is the most powerful plantar flexor. And along with the gastrocnemius, it shares that incredibly robust calcaneal tendon.
The Achilles tendon.
The Achilles.
And the primary antagonist to the calf is that large muscle on the front of the shin.
The tibialis anterior. It handles dorsiflexion, so pulling your foot up, and inversion. And when that muscle's attachment gets irritated and inflamed from repetitive stress,
That's where we get the dreaded shin splints.
it's shin splints, yes.
And then lateral stability and inversion, turning the foot out, is from the fibularis or peroneus muscles.
Right. And finally, inside the foot, you have the small intrinsic muscles. They originate right on the tarsal and metatarsal bones.
And their job is mainly stabilizing the arches.
Exactly. They provide fine toe control, but their key function is stabilizing the arches, especially the longitudinal arch, through constant low-level muscle tone.
And that thick connective tissue on the sole of the foot, the plantar aponeurosis, is also crucial for that.
Absolutely. And inflammation there leads to plantar fasciitis, which is that classic tenderness right at the heel. If it's left untreated, that chronic strain can even lead to a bony growth or a heel spur.
Okay, finally, let's circle back to compartmentalization in the lower limb, because you said this is where the anatomy can become a matter of life or death.
It absolutely can. So the thigh is split into 3 compartments: anterior for the quads, medial for the adductors, and posterior for the hamstrings. The leg is split into 4.
Anterior, lateral, superficial posterior, and deep posterior.
What's fascinating here is the crucial clinical importance of these rigid compartments, especially when there's trauma.
So what happens?
Well, when there's a crushing injury or severe swelling, blood and fluid rush into one of these compartments. But the deep fascia surrounding it is strong. It doesn't stretch.
So the pressure just builds and builds.
The pressure inside rises rapidly. This is compartment syndrome.
And the consequences.
Terrifying. It is. The rising pressure compresses the blood vessels, and that leads to ischemia, blood starvation. Nerves are incredibly sensitive to this. They can be destroyed in as little as 2 to 4 hours.
And the muscle itself.
The muscle tissue starts to die after about 6 hours. If that pressure isn't relieved immediately, usually with a surgery called a fasciotomy where they slice the fascia open.
The muscle is just replaced by scar tissue.
Inflexible scar tissue.
Yeah.
And that leads to permanent contracture and disability. It's a stark reminder of how finely balanced our muscular architecture really is.
It really is. So we've mapped the incredible mobility of the upper limb spurt versus shunt muscles, the delicate work of the rotator cuff.
And then we saw the sheer unyielding power demanded of the lower limb, driven by the iliopsoas, the quads, the hamstrings, all housed in those rigid and sometimes dangerous fascial compartments.
The biggest takeaway here, it seems, is not just memorizing the muscle names.
Not at all. It's understanding that relationship between the muscle's action line and the joint's axis. That is the ultimate predictive key. Once you see that relationship, the action is always predictable.
So the next time you lift a heavy bag of groceries off the floor, or you manage to run down a steep hill without falling, I want to challenge you to think about this. How many of those anatomical compartments are firing all at once? What level of precision is required from those little intrinsic muscles in your feet to stabilize your arches? And how tightly are your retinacula holding down dozens of tendons to prevent friction and failure?
That level of biomechanical precision, well, that's the definition of human movement.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the appendicular musculature. Keep exploring, and we'll see you in the next one.